The train's whistle pierced the morning's silence as it pulled away from Adelaide, leaving behind the last traces of civilization. Fiona Calloway pressed a gloved hand against the window, watching the landscape transform from rolling green hills to an endless expanse of red earth and thorny scrubland. The Royal Botanical Society had chosen her for this assignment, a 6-month expedition to catalogue the hardy flora of Australia's interior, and she had accepted with the confidence of someone who had spent 20 years studying specimens in London's finest botanical libraries. But books, she was beginning to realize, had not prepared her for this. The heat shimmered off the ground like liquid glass, and the sparse vegetation looked more like nature's cruel joke than scientific treasure. Fiona adjusted her practical cotton dress, the most sensible outfit she owned, and checked her leather satchel once more. Inside were her notebooks, pressed flower samples from England for reference, and a small vial of lavender water that already seemed woefully inadequate against the harsh reality outside. 3 days later, after a bone-rattling journey by mail truck to the remote settlement of Copper Creek, Fiona stood alone beside her camping equipment, watching the dust cloud of the departing vehicle disappear into the vastness. The settlement consisted of little more than a general store, a pub with a corrugated iron roof, and a handful of weathered buildings that seemed to crouch against the endless sky. Right then, she murmured to herself, adopting the crisp tone that had served her well in London lecture halls. Time to make botanical history. Armed with a collecting basket and a hand-drawn map from the store owner, Fiona set off into the scrubland with the determination of someone who had never been truly lost in her life. The thorny bushes caught at her skirts, and the sun beat down with merciless intensity. But she pressed on, documenting each new species with careful precision. It was when she stopped to examine a particularly interesting cluster of purple-flowered shrubs that she realized a terrible truth. Every direction looked exactly the same. The sun was sliding toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Fiona's water bottle was nearly empty. Her careful notes were smudged with perspiration, and panic was beginning to claw at the edges of her carefully maintained composure. That's when she heard it, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching through the scrub. If you enjoy stories of unexpected romance blooming in barren lands, of two hearts that clash before they connect, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know where our Outback tales are reaching. Chapter 1. A proper lady lost in the dust. Fiona's eyes fluttered open to unfamiliar wooden beams and the scent of strong tea brewing somewhere nearby. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous evening came flooding back. The approaching rider, his weathered face barely visible beneath a wide-brimmed hat, the way he'd looked down at her from his horse with an expression that mixed concern with something that might have been amusement. About time, came a gruff voice from across the small room. Was beginning to think I'd have to send for the undertaker instead of the doctor. Fiona sat up carefully, her head spinning slightly. The cabin was sparse but clean, with rough-hewn furniture and a stone fireplace where a kettle whistled cheerfully. At a simple wooden table sat the man who had rescued her, Tom Barden. He'd introduced himself as, his large hands wrapped around a tin mug of tea. "I don't require a doctor," Fiona said, straightening her shoulders despite the lingering dizziness. "I merely became temporarily disoriented." Tom's mouth twitched at one corner. That what they are calling it in England these days, being lost as a wombat in a wheat field. "I was conducting scientific research," Fiona replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "The Royal Botanical Society has entrusted me with cataloguing the indigenous flora of this region." "Flora," Tom repeated, taking a slow sip of his tea. "That'd be the plants that tried to tear your fancy dress to ribbons yesterday." Fiona looked down at her cotton dress, now decorated with small tears and dust stains that no amount of brushing would remove. These plants represent millions of years of evolutionary adaptation to harsh conditions. They deserve respect, not mockery. "Respect?" Tom said, setting down his mug with deliberate care. "Tell you what, Miss Calloway, was it? Next time you want to show your respect, maybe bring more than a thimbleful of water and a parasol to a desert." The criticism stung, partly because it was accurate. Fiona had underestimated the challenges of field work in the Outback, but she wasn't about to admit it to this rough-mannered colonial. "I suppose you think academic pursuits are worthless," she said, lifting her chin. "That education and scientific inquiry are just fancy folderol for people who don't know real work." Tom studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. "Lady, I've seen plenty of educated folks come through here. Most of them last about as long as an ice cream cone in hell. But you?" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You kept walking till you dropped, even when you had to know you were in trouble. That takes sand." Something in his tone made Fiona look at him more carefully. The lines around his eyes spoke of years spent squinting against the harsh sun, and his hands bore the permanent stains and scars of someone who worked with them daily. But there was intelligence in his weathered face, and a kind of weary gentleness that he seemed determined to hide. "Sand," she repeated. "Grit, backbone, whatever you want to call it." Tom stood and walked to the stove, returning with a second mug of tea that he set in front of her. Most folks would have sat down and waited to be rescued. You kept trying to rescue yourself. The tea was stronger than anything served in London drawing rooms, but it was exactly what she needed. As Fiona sipped it, she became aware of other sounds: the soft nickering of a horse somewhere outside, the padding of paws across the wooden floor. A medium-sized cattle dog appeared at Tom's elbow, regarding Fiona with intelligent brown eyes. "That's Bandit," Tom said, scratching behind the dog's ears. "He's the one who found you, actually. Smarter than most people I know." "Including me, apparently," Fiona admitted, surprised by her own honesty. Tom's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Outback's not forgiving of mistakes, but everybody makes them the first time out. Question is whether you learn from them. Over the next hour, as Fiona's strength returned, she found herself drawn into conversation despite herself. Tom spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. He asked thoughtful questions about her work, and when she described the unique adaptation she'd observed in the thorny shrubs, he listened with genuine interest. "That spiky bush you were looking at when I found you," he said eventually. "Sturt's desert pea country. Flowers come out purple after good rain. Haven't seen them bloom in 3 years." 3 years? Fiona set down her mug, interested despite herself. "The drought cycle must be more severe than I realized." "Drought, fire, flood," Tom said matter-of-factly. "Nature's not gentle out here. Plants that survive have to be tougher than old boots." "Rather like the people, I imagine," Fiona said quietly. Their eyes met across the small table, and for a moment, something passed between them, an understanding that went beyond words. Then Tom stood abruptly, clearing his throat. "Better get you back to town before folks start thinking the dingoes got you," he said. "Can't have the Royal Whatever Society sending a search party." But as they prepared to leave, Fiona found herself reluctant to return to the lonely room above the general store, to the isolation of her scholarly pursuits. There was something about this rough-hewn man in his simple cabin that felt more real than anything she'd experienced in years. "Mr. Barden," she said as he settled his horse. "Would you? That is, I wonder if you might consider serving as a guide? For my research. I mean, I'm clearly not equipped to navigate this terrain alone." Tom paused in his work, his hands still on the leather straps. "I'm no botanist. Lady, wouldn't know what did you call it, indigenous flora from a hole in the ground. But you know this land," Fiona pressed. "You know where the water is, where it's safe to camp, which areas might yield the most interesting specimens. I could pay you, of course." "Don't need your money," Tom said, but his tone wasn't harsh. "Got everything I need right here." "Then perhaps—" Fiona hesitated, then forged ahead. "Perhaps we could help each other. I could catalog what I find, and you could make sure I don't die of stupidity in the process." Tom turned to look at her, and she was startled to see what might have been amusement in his eyes. "Stupidity, eh? That what you call it when city folks try to conquer the desert with good intentions and a water bottle." "I prefer to think of it as ambitious optimism," Fiona replied, surprised to find herself smiling. And for the first time since she'd known him, Tom Barden laughed, a sound as unexpected as rain in the desert, and twice as welcome. Chapter 2, The Thorn and the Bloom. The partnership that emerged over the following weeks was unlike anything Fiona had imagined when she'd left London. Each morning, Tom would arrive at the general store with his horse and a packed mule loaded with supplies, greeting her with a taciturn nod and a tin cup of the strongest coffee she'd ever tasted. They would ride out into the scrubland together, Tom's experienced at guiding them to areas where the vegetation was most diverse, while Fiona documented everything with the methodical precision that had made her reputation in botanical circles. It was during these expeditions that Fiona began to see past Tom's gruff exterior to the man beneath. He had an intuitive understanding of the land that no amount of academic study could replicate, able to read the signs in the soil and sky that told stories of ancient floods and fires, of seasons of plenty and years of want. "See how the bark's twisted on that one?" he asked one morning, pointing to a gnarled tree that had somehow found purchase in a crack in the rocks. "Means it's been through at least a dozen bushfires. Each time, it dies back to almost nothing, then grows again." Fiona made careful notes, but she was more interested in the quiet reverence in Tom's voice when he spoke of such things. "How do you know so much about these plants?" she asked. "I thought drovers were mainly concerned with cattle and sheep." Tom was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, as they dismounted near a cluster of flowering shrubs, he said, "My wife was the one with the green thumb. Sarah. She could make anything grow, even out here where most things just survive." It was the first time he had mentioned a wife, and Fiona felt a curious pang at the revelation. "She must have been remarkable," she said carefully. "She was," Tom said simply, "died 8 years ago. Fever took her in 3 days. Nothing I could do but watch." The raw pain in his voice made Fiona's chest tighten with sympathy. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. Tom nodded once, then turned his attention to helping her collect samples. The conversation clearly closed. But something had shifted between them. A door had been opened, if only briefly, to the grief and loneliness that lay beneath his weathered exterior. It was 3 days later when the dust storm hit. They had been exploring a series of rocky outcroppings where Tom insisted the most interesting specimens could be found, when the western horizon began to darken with an ominous brown haze. Tom took one look at the approaching wall of dust and began packing their equipment with swift efficiency. "We need shelter," he said tersely. "That's going to be a big one." They made it to a shallow cave in the rocks just as the first winds arrived, carrying with them a stinging barrage of sand and debris. The storm struck with a fury that left Fiona breathless, the world outside their small refuge disappearing behind a churning wall of dust and wind. In the sudden intimacy of their shelter, with the storm raging outside like a living thing, they found themselves sitting closer together than they ever had before. The cave was barely large enough for 2 people, and in the dim light that filtered through the dust, Fiona was acutely aware of Tom's presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his shoulder brushed against hers when he shifted position. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked, having to raise her voice slightly to be heard over the wind. "Could be hours. Could be days," Tom replied. "Nothing to do but wait it out." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly violent gust shook the rocks around them, sending a small shower of dust and pebbles falling from the cave ceiling. Instinctively, Tom moved closer, his arm coming up to shield her from the debris. The gesture was protective rather than romantic, but Fiona found herself intensely aware of the solid strength of his arm, the masculine scent of sun-warmed skin and leather that seemed to emanate from him. When he didn't immediately move away, she allowed herself to lean slightly into his warmth, telling herself it was simply practical. They needed to conserve body heat in case the storm lasted through the night. "Tell me about England," Tom said after a while, his voice quieter now, as if the storm had created a pocket of intimacy that required softer words. "England?" Fiona was surprised by the request. "What would you like to know? What made you want to study plants? Must have been something to bring you all the way out here." Fiona considered the question, staring out at the wall of dust that had temporarily erased a world beyond their small cave. I suppose I've always been drawn to things that endure, she said finally. Plants that adapt and survive, that find ways to bloom even in impossible conditions. There's something hopeful about that. Hopeful, Tom repeated thoughtfully. My father died when I was quite young, Fiona found herself saying. Mother remarried within a year, a sensible match, she called it. I was sent away to school, and when I came home for holidays, it was as if I was visiting strangers. I found solace in the conservatory, in the quiet company of growing things that didn't judge or disappoint. Tom was silent for a moment. That's a lonely way to grow up, he said finally. I thought I preferred the solitude, Fiona admitted. Plants don't abandon you for more convenient arrangements. They don't make promises they can't keep. People aren't all like that, Tom said quietly. No, Fiona agreed, glancing at his profile in the dim light. I'm beginning to realize that. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Then Tom spoke again, his voice so low she had to strain to hear him. Sarah and I, we tried for years to have children. Never happened. She used to say the land would have to be our children, that we'd pour our love into making things grow instead. He paused, his jaw tightening. After she died, I couldn't. It felt like betrayal, caring for anything that might bloom. Easier to just tend the cattle, keep moving. Fiona felt her throat tighten with emotion. Without thinking, she placed her hand over his where it rested on his knee. She sounds like she was very wise, she said softly. Tom looked down at their joined hands but didn't pull away. She would have liked you, he said. Would have enjoyed talking plants with someone who understood why they matter. I wish I could have met her, Fiona said, and meant it. When Tom finally looked at her, his gray eyes were soft with an emotion she couldn't name. Fiona, he said, her name sounding different in his rough voice than it ever had before. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and longing. Fiona was aware of everything. The way the dim light caught the silver in his hair, the warmth of his hand beneath hers, the subtle scent of sage that clung to his clothes. She found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by something deeper than attraction, something that felt like recognition. But before anything could happen, a shift in the wind told them the storm was beginning to pass. Tom cleared his throat and gently extracted his hand from hers, moving to the cave entrance to assess their situation. Looks like it's moving on, he said, his voice carefully neutral. We'll be able to head back soon. Fiona nodded, trying to ignore the pang of disappointment that shot through her. But as they prepared to leave their temporary shelter, she noticed Tom carefully collecting several fallen branches from a thorny shrub that had been growing near the cave entrance. For kindling? She asked. Tom glanced at the branches in his hands, then at her. Something like that, he said, but his tone suggested there was more to the story. Later that evening, back at the settlement, Fiona would discover what he'd really been collecting. In a room above the general store, she found a small arrangement of the thorny branches in a tin cup on her washstand. Despite their harsh, spiky appearance, tiny purple buds were just beginning to show along the stems, the promise of flowers that would bloom only if carefully tended. There was no note, but Fiona understood the message. Even the thorniest things could bloom, given the right conditions and someone willing to nurture them through the difficult seasons. As she touched one of the tiny buds with gentle fingers, she realized that somewhere in the red dust and harsh beauty of the Outback, among the thorns and the endless sky, she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. Chapter 3. A new map to follow. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning that dawned clear and bright, with a kind of crystalline light that made even the harshest landscape look beautiful. Fiona had been in the Outback for nearly 4 months, and a collection of specimens and detailed notes had grown into what she knew would be a significant contribution to botanical science. More importantly, she had grown too, toughened by the sun and wind, made more resilient by the daily challenges of life in the wilderness. But it was the changes in her heart that mattered most. The feelings between her and Tom had deepened gradually, like roots finding water in dry soil. Their daily expeditions had become something precious, hours spent in comfortable companionship, sharing observations about the natural world and, increasingly, about themselves. There had been no grand declarations, no dramatic moments of passion, but rather a slow blooming of affection and respect that felt as natural as the desert flowers that appeared after rain. She had been sketching a particularly intricate succulent when old Murphy from the general store climbed the stairs to a room with a telegram in his weathered hand. "This came in on the wire this morning, Miss Calloway," he said, handing her the yellow envelope with obvious curiosity. "All the way from London, it says." Fiona's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Telegrams from London were expensive and rare, sent only for matters of great importance. As her eyes scanned the brief message, her heart began to race. "Extraordinary work stop Royal Society demands immediate return stop prepare specimens for transport stop lecture tour range stop fame and recognition await stop depart sooner stop." She read it 3 times before the full meaning sank in. The specimens and notes she had been sending back to London had created quite a stir in botanical circles. Several of her discoveries were entirely new to science, and the Royal Society wanted to capitalize on the achievement with a lecture tour that would cement her reputation as one of Britain's foremost field botanists. Everything she had worked for her entire career was being offered to her on a silver platter. So why did she feel as though the world had just crumbled beneath her feet? "Good news, I hope?" Murphy asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Yes," Fiona managed. "Very good news indeed." But as the old man left her alone with the telegram, Fiona sank into a single chair and stared out at the endless red landscape that had become, somewhere along the way, more like home than London had ever been. She was still sitting there an hour later when Tom arrived for their morning expedition. He took one look at her face and the telegram in her hands and seemed to understand immediately. "Calling you back, are they?" he asked quietly. Fiona nodded, not trusting her voice. Tom was silent for a long moment, his hat in his hands, his grey eyes fixed on some point beyond the window. "Well," he said finally, that's wonderful. What you've been working toward all along." "Yes," Fiona said, the word feeling like dust in her mouth. "When do you leave?" "As soon as I can arrange passage. They want me back in London within the month." Tom nodded slowly, then placed his hat back on his head with deliberate care. "Best get started on packing your specimens. Then, make sure they survive the journey." The practical tone of his voice cut deeper than any dramatic protestation would have. This was Tom, accepting the inevitable with the same stoic grace he showed in the face of drought or bushfire or any of nature's other cruel certainties. "Tom," Fiona began, but he was already moving toward the door. "I'll leave you to it," he said without turning around. "Congratulations, Fiona. You've earned this." And then he was gone, leaving her alone with a triumph that felt remarkably like defeat. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of packing and preparation. Tom continued to help her collect and preserve specimens, but the easy companionship they had shared was replaced by a careful politeness that broke Fiona's heart a little more each day. He spoke only when necessary, kept his distance, and seemed to have retreated behind the same gruff walls she had encountered when they first met. Fiona told herself it was better this way. Clean breaks were easier than lingering attachments. She had a career to return to, a reputation to build, a life in London that she had worked years to establish. Whatever she had found in the Outback, whatever she had imagined she had found, was just a romantic interlude, a temporary madness brought on by isolation and the strange intimacy of shared hardship. But her heart knew better. The evening before departure, Fiona sat in a small room above the general store, surrounded by carefully labeled crates and specimen boxes, and tried to write letters to colleagues in London. Every sentence felt false. Every expression of excitement rang hollow. Finally, she gave up and simply sat by the window, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson as it settled toward the horizon. She must have fallen asleep in her chair, because she woke to the sound of the morning train whistle in the distance. Her departure train, the one that would carry her away from the Outback and back to civilization, back to the life she had always believed she wanted. Murphy had arranged for a wagon to take her and her specimens to the railway station. As she supervised the loading of her crates, she found herself scanning the small crowd that had gathered to see her off, mostly out of curiosity. She suspected, Since the departure of the English botanist was likely the most interesting thing to happen in Copper Creek in months. But Tom was nowhere to be seen. The wagon driver was loading the last of her boxes when Murphy approached with something in his weathered hands. "Found this on the store counter this morning," he said, holding out a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "No note, but I reckon it's for you." Fiona's hand shook as she unwrapped the package. Inside was a cutting from the same thorny shrub Tom had collected during the dust storm, but this one was in full bloom, its branches covered with the most beautiful purple flowers she had ever seen. Tucked among the thorns was a single piece of paper with a message written in Tom's careful, unpracticed hand. "Some thorns are worth keeping close." Fiona stared at the flowers through a blur of tears, understanding flooding through her like sunlight after rain. These were not just any flowers. They were from the bush that grew near Sarah's grave, the one Tom had tended in secret all these years, the one that had finally bloomed again after 3 seasons of drought. He was giving her more than flowers. He was giving her his heart, his hope, his faith in new beginnings. The wagon driver cleared his throat. "Miss, train won't wait much longer." Fiona looked at the flowers in her hands, then at the loaded wagon, then at the distant plume of smoke that marked the approaching train. In that moment, she had to choose between the life she had planned and the life she had discovered, between the safety of familiar success and the uncertain promise of something infinitely more precious. The choice, when it came, was surprisingly easy. "Mr. Murphy," she said, turning to the store owner with sudden determination. "I wonder if you might send another telegram to London for me." 20 minutes later, Tom Barden looked up from mending a fence post behind his cabin to see a familiar figure approaching on foot across the scrubland. Fiona walked steadily toward him, still wearing her traveling dress but carrying her botanical collecting basket instead of a suitcase. "Thought you'd be halfway to Adelaide by now," he said, straightening slowly. "I sent a telegram to London," Fiona replied, stopping a few feet away from him. "Told them I discovered several more species that require further study. I've been granted an extension, indefinitely, if needed." Tom's expression didn't change, but she saw his knuckles whiten where he gripped the fence post. "That's so. I also told them that I found something here that's far more valuable than any botanical specimen," she continued, her voice steady despite the way her heart was hammering against her ribs. "And what might that be?" Tom asked quietly. Instead of answering with words, Fiona reached into her collecting basket and withdrew the flowering branch he had left for her. "A cutting from a bush that everyone said would never bloom again," she said. "Proof that even the thorniest things can flower, given the right conditions and someone willing to tend them through the difficult seasons." Tom's gray eyes met hers, and for the first time in 2 weeks, she saw the warmth return to them. "Might be that bush needs tending too," he said. "Someone who understands that the most beautiful things are often the ones that grow in the hardest places." "I think I might know someone like that," Fiona said, stepping closer. This time, when Tom reached for her, there was no storm to interrupt them, no duty to call them back to the world beyond their small circle of understanding. When his lips met hers, it was with the gentleness of someone who had learned that the most precious things were also the most fragile, and the passion of someone who had thought he would never again have a chance to hold something beautiful in his weathered hands. When they finally broke apart, Fiona rested her forehead against his and smiled. "I hope you don't mind having a permanent research partner," she said. "Someone who still has a great deal to learn about desert flora, and the people who love it." "Reckon I could teach you a thing or two," Tom said, his own smile transforming his weathered face. "Long as you don't mind learning that some of the best discoveries can't be pressed in books or sent to museums." "I'm beginning to understand that," Fiona replied. "Some discoveries are meant to be lived rather than catalogued." As the sun set over the red landscape that had become their world, Tom and Fiona stood together among the thorns and the unexpected flowers. Two hearts that had found each other in the vast loneliness of the Outback. They had learned that love, like the desert's most beautiful blooms, often grew in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the greatest adventures began not with grand plans and careful preparation, but with the simple courage to stay when everything else told you to go. The Royal Botanical Society would eventually receive Fiona's most important discovery, not a new species of plant, but the radical finding that some of life's most valuable specimens could only be properly studied with the heart as well as the mind, and that the rarest flowers of all were the ones that bloomed between two people brave enough to put down roots in difficult ground. If the story of resilience, thorns, and late blooming love touched your heart, leave a comment and subscribe for more journeys into Australia's forgotten corners. Every story we tell blooms brighter with your voice added to it.